Well, good morning, and welcome to another week of Journey with Christ. I'm your host, Mark Mitchell, a preaching minister at the Park Avenue Church of Christ here in Charleston, West Virginia. So glad you joined us this week. And as always, we have Steve Fox being the expert. How you doing today, buddy?
No, that's my dad that was the expert. It wasn't me. At least that's what he kept telling me. I'm doing fine, and I apologize for missing last week because I've been hosting Jeopardy the last few days, and they haven't called me yet, but I'm waiting for the call. If Aaron Rodgers can do that, I can do that. So I'm waiting by the phone to see if maybe they'll call me and ask me. I mean, if they'll call me and give me the job.
Yeah, there you go.
But besides that, with that little bit of tension, I'm doing okay.
Well, great. You know, Steve and I were talking earlier. For anyone who does hiking or climbing over big mountains, you know, Pikes Peak, Mount Everest, there are certain mountains once you've done them, I mean, it's like you're done with your bucket list. Well, Steve and I feel like we just got through climbing a big mountain. So anything here now is easy. We fell down a few times, didn't we? Yeah. Or at least you ran out of oxygen.
I was okay, but you ran out of oxygen several times.
But anything today, and of course, I think the parable is one of the most fun topics.
I do too.
Because Jesus does not always come out and say exactly what he's saying. Mm-hmm. And that makes for interesting conversations. Intended.
Yeah, it does.
Well, we're going to, I guess, be doing, and you're taking us down this path. Where are we going here, buddy?
Well, give our audience a definition of what a parable is.
Well, a parable is a story told with a deeper meaning, but it doesn't always necessarily, I know that many times there's been discussion over it has a moral to it. But Jesus' parables don't always have a moral to them. Sometimes they ask a huge question. Mm-hmm. You know,
back at you.
Right back at you. Now, you can turn that into a moral device, but it's not always intended to do that. It's always, like I've heard some people say, find yourself in the story.
Mm-hmm. You're reading my notes.
Yeah, well, but it is an important tool by which we connect with a biblical or a godly truth. Mm-hmm. Would be.
And let me give you an example of that. We're going to study several parables. I've read different commentaries. Some say 50, some say 53. Let's just use the number 50. Jesus told 50 parables. Some of them are very, very short, maybe 2 verses.
Some of them are just a couple lines.
Yes, and some of them are more lengthy, like Lazarus and the rich man, and the prodigal son, and the good Samaritan. Those are a little bit longer, but it's always good if you understand the background and the context of each of those parables. You said it's a story that has some kind of heavenly meaning. I don't know of an exception to this, but if you read the parables, Jesus in his parables always makes a point. You don't have to look for 10 things or 15 things that he said here or 4
The prodigal is difficult because it has several points. But
yes. The overall parable has 1 point, and right. His are all like that. So what I suggested, and that's what you and I have talked about before, is when you look at these parables, find yourself. Mm-hmm. Just put yourself in a position where you were in the first century and you were listening to this man speak. What is he saying to me? Now, he's obviously saying things to the early learners, the first people who heard these stories. But when you get that and you figure out what is his 1 point, then you have to say, well, what about me? What does it say to me 2,000 years after he said it?
Right.
Now, here's part of the context I'd like us to work on throughout the entire series. Some people say, why are there 4 Gospels? If you're walking down the street and you just pick out somebody and say, why are there 4 Gospels? Most people wouldn't be able to tell you at all why there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, people who are scholars who have studied this a lot more than you and I have and are a lot smarter than you and I are, those people point out that there are 4 Gospels because there are 4 different characteristics and 4 different descriptions of Jesus. Matthew wants his audience to know one thing: Jesus is the King.
That's right.
And that's why as we go through here, most of all the parables we're going to read out of Matthew, because Matthew wants his audience to know that Jesus is the King. Not Caesar, not anybody else. Jesus is the King. So guess what you got in Matthew? A bunch of kingdom parables. Mark wants everybody to know, in his audience, which was Gentile, that this man was not only a king, he was a servant. He was a king and he was a servant. That's hard for us to figure out in our mind, but that's what Mark wants his audience to know. Luke says he's the Son of Man. John says he's the Son of God. So you put those 4 ideas together and you have it's like a jigsaw puzzle putting pieces together, or like an angle from a camera in a Super Bowl. You see the same angle, see the same thing from 5 or 6 different angles. We're going to look at parables, but we have to remember, who are they writing these parables to, and what does Jesus mean when he says those? So those 4 things we have to get in our head before we even look at any of the parables.
And we're beginning today with the parable of the sower in Matthew 13, right?
Yes.
Okay.
You want to read verses 1 through 9?
Sure. Okay. Matthew 13, verses 1 through 9. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, A farmer went out to sow his seed. And as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it didn't have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 160, 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear.
Do you remember the first time you ever read this and somebody told you there are 4 kinds of hearts?
Yes.
This is one of those parables that's pretty easy to get figured out what he's talking about, because twice in Matthew 13 the apostles come back and say to him, hey, what's that story mean?
Yeah.
And then he tells them. He doesn't say, go figure it out. I'm not going to tell you. He says, this is what there are. There are 4 seeds.
Yeah.
And, I mean, not 4 seeds. There's 1 seed and four different soils. As I said a little while ago, Matthew has all these kingdom parables. Matthew starts out with Jesus saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. To have a kingdom, you got to have a king. You got to have some kind of territorial boundaries, and you have to have people who are willing to submit to that king. If you have a king and there's nobody that submits to that king, you don't have a kingdom. You just got one king walking around looking for a kingdom. So Jesus' first message was, excuse me. Jesus' first message was, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And guess what? That's not the first time they heard that, because John the Baptist's message was, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So that you have all those ideas all the way through Matthew, because he wants them to know that Jesus is a king. Like I said a little while ago, depending on who you read, a couple commentaries that I had said Jesus told that meant 50 parables, and that the kingdom, the word kingdom, is found in Matthew 53 times. Now, if the word kingdom is found in one book 53 times, somebody must be wanting somebody to think this is important.
It's significant, yes.
Very, very significant. You already gave us a definition of a parable. It's truth in pictures. It's like what we would call in the modern day an illustration. He's going to give us an illustration. Not going to come out and tell us exactly what it is, but he's going to give us an illustration. And these parables certainly gained the interest of people who were around him. What are your thoughts about, we're going to stay there for a little bit, but what are your thoughts about 13, 1 through 9 that you just read?
Well, as we've mentioned before, it is a very well-known parable. I mean, it's for me, there's a couple points that I didn't really resonate immediately when I first read. Once you get past the four soils, and too many times what I find myself in a parable is once I got the big point, I ignore everything else. But I shouldn't do that.
The other way around.
I should see all the other points in order to get a clear definition of the big point.
If you were standing on that hill that day and you heard that parable, you have to ask yourself, what did that parable mean to the first century hearers?
Yeah.
And then, 2,000 years later, we're still reading the same parable. What does that parable mean to me now? Instead of the other way around. Well, I want to tell you what the parable means about you and to you. And then if we get a little bit of time, we'll talk about what it meant to the first century hearers. Exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite.
Yeah. It's kind of an important thing to note that Jesus primarily, anytime he speaks a parable, speaks to the three biggest, well, not maybe the three biggest, but to popular understandings. Most everybody in around the area that Jesus is preaching knows something about a farmer sowing seed. I mean,
he may have said it's like a farmer sowing seed and pointed to some guy who's out in the middle of the field doing that.
Because a lot of Jesus' parables deal with an agricultural context.
Growth.
Or with water and ships is another big one. And then religious attitudes, So all of these would have been very prevalent to their daily life. To a Jew, they had a tremendous amount of experience with all three of these and participated in all three of these, so they would have got it. For me, a farmer went out to sow his seed is a simple statement, but it has a tremendous amount of meaning when we start putting in the characters in the story. Because we can't just ignore the fact that we're talking about soils, which is ourselves. Well, who's the farmer? Who's the seed? What's the seed? There's more than the big main point.
And the one thing that's, I think, pretty obvious in the first part of this parable is there's one kind of seed. He's not sowing wheat and corn and
he's sowing one
grapes
seed.
And apples and oranges. And he's sowing one kind of seed. Now, there are 4 different kinds of places where that seed can fall. There's just only one seed.
And there's one sower.
And that goes back to, this parable is a little more interesting. No, that's not true. This parable is maybe a little more significant, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, because of the subject and because of the subject matter, because he wants these people to understand there is only one seed. And when they come to him, the apostles come to him and say, what do you mean by that story? What do you mean by that parable? Now, there are a lot of parables that Jesus told nobody ask anything. And maybe the message was that clear. But here, at least on 2 occasions in Matthew 13, people come to him and say, including the apostles, what's that mean? And he tells them.
Yes.
So, as you read this, you think, this is pretty nice. We got a parable where he explains it. Of course, maybe they didn't even understand the explanation either. But here is a parable that when Jesus tells and they come to him and say, tell us what that means, he tells them what that means.
And you know, the beauty of what his explanation is in the variables. He doesn't concentrate specifically on the seed or himself. He goes right to the variable, which means for me, which means the consistency of what he's presenting is in himself. The soil is the condition by which will depend on how well the seed does.
Yes.
It's not on his ability, because I'm God, as we were going to find out. The seed is the absolute truth and life of the kingdom. But the condition of the soil will determine what happens.
And as it's thrown out there, different things happen to it.
That's right. It still sprouts.
It sprouts, but just for a little bit.
For a little bit, or for a huge harvest.
Let me read the Jesus' explanation here. This is 13:10. And the disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And he answered and said to them, "To you it's been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven." There's the kingdom again. "But to them it's not been granted. For whoever has, to him shall be more given, and he shall have an abundance. For whoever does not have, even what he has shall be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables." Now this is the fun part. I suggested that I read this so you could explain it. "And while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in their case the prophecy of Isaiah is being fulfilled, which says, 'You will keep on hearing, but will not understand. You will keep on seeing, but will not perceive.'" These are soils that he's talking about, that the seed was sown in. "For the heart of the people has become dull, and with their ears they scarcely hear, and they have closed their eyes, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with them heart and turn again. Understand with their heart and turn again, and I should heal them." Boy, when you read these people in the first century that were listening to this, said, "Well, wait a minute, don't you want everybody to turn and repent and come to you? And now you're telling us that they're not going to understand these parables because of the fact that they're so difficult. They can't figure out what it means. They got eyes, but they can't see. They got ears, but they can't hear." And in the next explanation we're going to look at, Jesus even says Satan comes and takes that seed out of a man's heart.
Yeah. Takes it away.
Now, what we'll do with that is we'll just cross that out and act like it's not in the Bible.
Well, you know, for me, Paul is one of my favorite individuals to grasp where he came from, because there is not a more learned Jew at that time.
No.
And he didn't see Jesus as the sower. He didn't see Jesus as the Son of God. And he looked at that seed as chaff, as weeds.
He looked at people around him as being phonies.
Right.
Because they were following something that was not accurate at all.
So, when he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, 4, and 5, this epiphany that he has, and he couldn't see anything until he saw Jesus as the Son of God. Mm-hmm. And the minute that happened, the split second that happened, then his eyes were opened, his ears were open, and his heart was ready to understand. For me, that has always been the situation with understanding who Jesus is, and hearing and seeing and understanding what we're reading. Because until you make Jesus the Son of God, none of this will ever make sense.
That's right. There were two things basically in the gospel, and obviously this parable is a part of that gospel. Mm-hmm. How men will receive that message. But there are two things you need to look at in a parable: is where is Jesus in here?
Yeah.
And where am I in here?
Yeah.
Because if I start studying him long enough and I say to myself and my family and other people, I believe in him and I'm going to allow him to control my life, there is a belief to be had. And that belief is what you just said, that this man was divine. He came from the authority of God. He was the Son of God. And there's also an act to be obeyed based on your belief that Jesus was the Son of God. I get to do what he did, death, burial, and resurrection, just like he went through. When I say that I believe that, I believe in his authority enough that I want to do that.
That's right.
Yeah.
You move forward with it. It is at that moment that in Jesus' parable here is that the seed sprouts. Now, to the extent that the soil is completely ready,
three of them are bad and one of them's good.
Right.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. There's not a person living who doesn't have sometimes some rocky soil in their life, and there's certain areas of their life that need to be cleaned up. We live in a culture now that is nothing but thorns, where the entire world is choking it out because it can't get it. And I've known in my past that taking care of a garden, because I'm somebody who raises a garden. In fact, my dad, about 3 weeks ago, he has a tractor and he brought his cult turning tine, which basically digs the dirt and flips it over. Mm-hmm. Well, yesterday he came in with the cultivator, which then breaks up all that big dirt now, and there's not a weed in that garden right now, and it's as pristine as you can imagine. But let me ask you something. There's seed in that ground, and if it is not taken care of, what's going to happen?
It's going to die.
Well, the weeds are going to come up,
and it's not.
And the weeds are going to choke it out.
There may be a little bit of time where it has some growth, but eventually it's going to be gone.
I remember one year, a couple of years back, I got real busy and didn't have time. I planted all the seed. I got the garden out, and I actually got it plowed one time, but then life got busy for me, and I didn't get back to it. And when I went when stuff started coming in, I kind of thought maybe I'd have a little bit of stuff. I hardly had anything out there. The weeds choked all the nutrients. I had pretty corn stalks with no corn on them. I had pretty green bean vines with no green beans on them.
And look at all the farmers in the United States that get up early and go to bed late and work and work and work. And then a tornado comes through or something happens and they got nothing.
They got nothing.
All that work for nothing. I think, like you said, these people could look at a farmer and say, I know what he's doing. I know what he's going through.
I know what he's going through. I know what's there. And there's a huge amount of responsibility that comes with the soil, even though it doesn't come out right out and say that.
The first time that they ask him, Jesus says in 13:18, hear then this parable of the sower. When a man hears, this is when they came to him and said, what's this mean? When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, well, that's a lot of people, the evil one comes and snatches away what's been sown in his heart. So man is somehow cooperating with Satan, because Satan is eventually going to take this seed out of his heart.
Yep.
Now, I know that's a tough verse for some of us who have religious backgrounds where we don't think Satan's doing anything in life or doing anything right now.
Virtually.
It's just our choice.
Yeah.
We make the choice. But I'll let our audience read those verses and try to figure it out, and then they can call me when they figure it out. This is the one on whom the seed was sown beside the road. So I'm not going to read the whole rest of this, but from chapter 13, verse 1 down through 18, when they said, tell us what this means, and why do you speak in parables? And he gave those explanations. 4 kinds of soils, 4 kinds of hearts. And by the way, that's taken from your favorite Old Testament book. It's taken from Isaiah chapter 6. I'd like for you to get this verse for us, because I think we need to discuss this for a minute. Mark, not Matthew, Mark 4, verse 13. You got that on there?
No, I do not.
Mark 4, verse 13.
Mark 4, verse 13.
Yes. This is an interesting idea about what we've just been talking about this morning.
Then Jesus said to them, "Don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? The farmer sows the word. Some people are like seed along the path where the word is sown, and as soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown in them. Others, like seed sown on rocky places, hear the word, and at once receive it with joy. But since they have no root, they only last a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Still others, like seed sown among the thorns, hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come and choke the word, making it unfruitful. Others, like seed sown on good soil, hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop, some 30, some 60, some 100 times what was sown."
I want us to look at one thing that maybe some people will just jump over or miss it. Read 13 for us again, please. 4:13.
Then Jesus said to them, "Don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable?"
Let's say you're sitting in your office one day and I come in and I say, "Will you help me with trigonometry?" And you say, "Well, sure I will, but when did you have arithmetic?" "Oh, I haven't had arithmetic." "But would you help me with my calculus?" "When did you have calculus?" "Oh, I never had calculus. I'm still working on my arithmetic." I worked on my arithmetic, and then algebra and plane geometry and trigonometry and calculus,
then comes calculus.
And all that stuff. And then comes the calculus. But I want you to explain calculus to me. You don't understand arithmetic. That's a very good question. How are you going to understand that if you haven't understood this?
Well, this would be like trying to become say you're a doctor and you have never studied biology, so you know.
Never done that. And you know what? If I'm going to get operated on by a doctor, I'd like to be operated on by a doctor who didn't cheat his way through medical school.
Yeah.
I want somebody who knows what he's doing, maybe.
Absolutely.
4:13 is so significant. Do you not understand this parable? And how will you understand all the parables? Jesus says this is the foundation parable. This is the primary parable. If you don't understand this one, you won't understand any of the other ones. Now, are the other ones important? Yeah. But here is somebody that Jesus said, if you haven't had arithmetic, calculus is not in your brain at all. It's not there. Because you need to set forth the foundation. This is the foundation of all his parables, he says in verse 13. Do you not understand this parable? And how will you understand all the other parables?
Again, goes back to the very concept of the discussion coming out of Isaiah chapter 6, which Isaiah, I want to sometime go and count how many times he says the expression, those who have ears, let them hear, and those who have eyes to see, let them see. But then, of course, he always says, but this generation will
doesn't have that.
It's not going to happen. And inevitably, there is a huge understanding that Isaiah brings up about, beginning with chapter 1 through 6, where he has his woe unto, and he goes through a big woe list. And then he finally gets his own woe is me. And it all concludes with one specific truth. God is God. And if you don't get that part on, none of this other stuff is going to ever make sense to you. Because Israel had left God by the time of Isaiah's writing, and he's looking around, and I'm sure he's kind of like wondering to himself, as he does through his first 5 chapters of woes. And then he has his scene before the throne, and then all of a sudden he says, woe is me,
That section of scripture, which is, I interrupted you, go ahead.
Go ahead. No.
That section of scripture is not only one of your favorites, it's one of Jerry Alderson's favorites too. Hello, Jerry and Sandra, because I know they watch this all the time. Probably take meticulous notes too. Ask each other questions as they do their nightly devotion.
Any comment would be really welcome.
In Isaiah, that first part, chapters 1 through 6, it's Jerry's favorite passage because Isaiah says the train filled the temple.
Oh, that's a great.
So Jerry goes down to his basement and plays with his trains and comes up and watches Isaiah's train fill the temple.
Yeah. Well, you know.
He likes Isaiah almost as much as you do.
Well, for me, like I said, it was, as one preacher I heard say one time, it was the first gospel. You know, the good news of Jesus Christ coming.
Jesus says that.
Yeah.
The gospel was first preached to Abraham, and it was also preached to Isaiah.
Yeah. But, you know, the importance of understanding, you're never going to hear anything or understand anything until you got the sower worked out.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And
what we say at the beginning, look in this parable and say, who am I in that parable?
Yeah.
Okay, am I the sower? No.
Nope.
Am I the seed? No.
Nope.
I'm one of those four hearts.
That's right.
I'm one of those four different kinds of soil, and I'm going to have to decide how I want that seed to develop and grow in that soil.
Well, having raised a lot of gardens, you were asking about this concept of Satan coming in, you know.
Yes.
I understand that we don't literally see it, but here's the thing. Every time I plant corn seed or bean seed or any other kind of seed that goes down in the ground, the birds are watching. And I can guarantee you, they're out there looking for that seed that has been sown in that soil. And they'll find it too.
My grandpa said one time that, and he was a farmer, not a big farmer, but like you. And he said he put my grandma out in the cornfield as a scarecrow. And he said not only did they not steal any corn, they brought back what they stole last year. My grandpa just had a way with words.
Well, you know, there are times that the one beauty that you brought up very early on, even when people work hard and have a good, and let's say they've kept the soil perfect, they've plowed it, they've tilled it, and they've done everything right, they watered when they were supposed to, but then there's a storm comes and destroys the crop.
Everything's gone.
The one truth that that is consistent is that there's going to be tragedies that come along, and we don't like that in our stories. Now, the tragedy in our particular story here is, this is a personal one outside the caveat of Satan coming. But the first part is on us.
Yeah.
What do you see? Who do you see? And what's your response?
And as we talked about a little while ago, Jesus, when they came to him and said, what does this mean? He sits down and explains it to them. Now, I don't know what their logic was, or what their, were they affected the next day or 2 days after that by what they heard that morning or that afternoon. You read through you read Matthew 5, 6, and 7 through the Beatitudes. There's a whole lot of verses in there that say, this is how I want your action to be. Parables have that same idea. I'm going to tell you a story, but you're not just going to listen to the story. It will affect your actions.
There is a response.
There's a response. It'll affect your life. And if you just go through reading these stories, they're not going to do you any good anyway. But if you pick out that one thing that Jesus is trying to teach in every one of those parables, and we just looked at what it is in Matthew 13, there's somebody who sows seed and something happens to that seed.
That's right.
So those are the stories that Jesus told, and it's nice. I wish I don't. I was going to say I wish he'd done that with every parable, but he does it with a lot of parables. like, explain this to us, and then he'll sit down and explain it to them.
Right. And, inevitably, one of the things I was just thinking of when you were sharing that part, for the disciples who are going to become apostles, they still see Jesus as the Messiah, future king of the kingdom, but they see him not as a sower of seed, or the great rabbi. Though, they call him rabbi because he keeps teaching them. I think they call him rabbi not because in the beginning because he's a teacher, but because he keeps teaching. Mm-hmm. It isn't until the resurrection till all this stuff begins.
And they are so excited about this teaching because, as we looked at the beginning, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. They hear John the Baptist teach that message. They hear Jesus teach that message. Man, it's getting close.
Hey, we're about to get set free.
We're going to get all our army together. It may not be much of one, but we're going to get our army together. And
Peter's got his sword.
We're going to take on Rome. Put your sword up. No, one's enough. It'll be fine. But they heard this message and they got excited. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. John the Baptist and Jesus both.
Yeah.
And then they start telling kingdom parables. These kingdom parables are close to being...
Yeah, and you're about to get into a few. We've basically run out of time. Do you have anything you want to say to conclude?
The only thing I want to say to conclude is just remember as we go through Matthew, and that's what we're going to do, we're just going to go through Matthew and take each individual parable. But as you read these, try to remember two things. What does it mean to the first century Christian, or first century Jew who listened to these stories? And secondly, who am I in that parable?
Who am I?
If you ask yourself who you are in that parable and you've got that figured out, you're doing exactly what Jesus wanted us all to do.
And there's always, I'm not going to say always, but sometimes in their parable there's who are we and then which one of them should I have been. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, always good questions to be had.
Don't skip over a parable and say this doesn't have anything to do with me.
Yeah, you're there.
Yeah.
We're all there.
Whether it's 2,000 years separated or right now, we're there.
Well, listen, we're so glad you joined us. We look forward to, and I guess next week we'll be in the parable of the weeds. And if you have any questions, any comments, we look forward to any input that you would have. And as always, we look forward to seeing you again next week. And on behalf of Steve and I, God bless and see you next week.